NBC10 At Issue.
NBC10 At Issue. Can better cooperation take hold in America, or are self-interest, fear, and blunt force the only qualities left? How will this climate affect the race for governor and other elections next year? We'll hear from two veteran Pennsylvania political leaders now on NBC10 At Issue. Good morning. I'm Steve Highsmith. Merry Christmas to you. Debating, even fighting over ideas is by far not a new thing, but can conservative Republicans and progressive Democrats ever agree enough to tackle big environmental, energy, health, infrastructure, education, security, and economic issues while protecting individual freedoms and not bankrupting the government? After 5 years of the Obama presidency, and as we enter the congressional election year, in Pennsylvania will elect a governor, and New Jersey and Delaware each a U.S. senator, what did we learn? With me now are former Pennsylvania Governor Mark Schwieker, a Republican, and former U.S. Representative Joe Sestak, a Democrat. Each has been talked about as candidates for future elections. They are currently co-chairs of the Pennsylvania State Advisory Committee of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here.
Good to be with you, Steve.
It has been said in the past that the idea with legislation was to mainstream it so it could get passed. But in recent years, what we've seen is that the party in power bludgeons something through, or the party not in power bludgeons it to a stop. Why is this happening?
Well, I think to some extent the read across the country and in Pennsylvania comes largely because of the standoffs in Washington, D.C. I don't think that's the general condition in state capitals. But, Steve, I don't think we can answer the question without reflecting on how we, the process of electing members to the House and the Senate, particularly in the House. We have this polarization that's gone on. I mean, the folks that end up with the nominations are often, when you take a close look, born to the far right or born to the far left, and as a result, it's very difficult process-wise when legislative efforts begin to reconcile those two. And I think so it really might boil down to just the destructive side of gerrymandering that creates those districts where only the extreme kind of candidates can rise to the top.
Congressman, would you agree with that?
Well, I do agree the process has to be changed somewhat. But I think more important, as important as that, is that we just don't have the titans there any longer, at least on the federal level. We have people who are more concerned, I think, as elected officials about their job security. Second, they tend to put party above people. And third, and probably worse, very few of these men and women seem to want to be held accountable for their deeds. Although they'll be accountable for their intentions, but then they say, I tried to do it, but the other side prevented me from making it happen. And that's, I think, is why the biggest deficit in America is not the debt. It's the trust deficit, because they know their leaders aren't willing to be held accountable for laying out a transparent benchmark and saying, hold me accountable for that. My job should rely upon that. That's what's missing.
But there are some people who think that we've romanticized past eras of alleged bipartisanship, that while some of that has happened, that there has always been conflict in this country, and that even in the Federalist Papers there's an interpretation that says that we can only really move forward incrementally in this country. Do you accept that, or do you think big things can get done?
I think that transformational change is extremely hard because of what the governor just said. But there were some titans even more recently. Look, you could have a Ted Kennedy and a John McCain reach across the aisle and say, let's do immigration reform. And they did in 2005. And then they came to the Senate and nothing happened. And then you could have a George Bush and a Ted Kennedy also reach across an immigration reform and No Child Left Behind. They got one of those two through. It was quite transformational. You may agree or disagree, but very few are willing to do that principled compromise anymore. We had that when Medicare came forward and Medicaid and other types of civil rights issues.
Governor, when you were governing, did you feel that you could do big things, that you had a chance, and the other people like Tom Ridge could do big things, or did you feel that it was only incremental?
No. Well, it has to be discussed categorically based on the issue. I mean, I would, reflect back to, our hunger to improve the Philadelphia schools and the school reform effort there. Without, bipartisan effort on the part of key Democrats in the House and in the Senate, we probably would have come up short. But we got it done, and the school reform effort is still underway. But, These are difficult times, and I do believe in the state capitals, to a great extent, the bipartisan effort is there. It's only to a large extent, Steve. It's the federal government and the fact that you have many office holders that are into 24/7 campaigning as opposed to 24/7 governing. And we've got these standoffs, and it's frustrating to the folks that are listening to this show right now.
The lesson of the Affordable Care Act to this date, or Obamacare, what is the lesson or the chief lesson or two for you?
Well, execution in the operational realm is as important as the original policy construct. I mean, Americans generally understand what the president wants to accomplish in terms of making structural arrangements to provide affordable health care to Americans. Obviously, at the in the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Secretary Sebelius has acknowledged this herself, that came up short on execution, and that has created tremendous frustration. I think adds to this notion sentimentally that Washington can't get it right. So I think without a doubt, thinking it through to that extent was a real shortcoming.
But Congressman, the idea of Obamacare and the passage of it at that stage when it was passed, was that an example of a bludgeoning through that either had to be done and that was the only way, or was it a mistake not to try harder to work with the Republicans?
Many argued in the Democratic Party it was the only way to get it through, but I disagree. I think there were some ideas out there on the Republican side that were worthy of deep consideration. Break down state boundaries so some company in California could have an insurance plan here in Pennsylvania. Let small businesses come together in a large group to negotiate with Blue Cross Blue Shield for best prices. Second, I do agree with the governor. The implementation of it was absolutely inexcusable with the website. But finally, and most important, the overall principle of why government tried to make this happen should not be lost. We don't want government to overly intrude upon our liberties, but at the same time, government can be a force providing opportunity. We give health care in the military not because we're liberal socialists, but because we want healthy warriors. That's why we want healthy workers here, and that was the real objective.
We'll talk more about campaign spending and more with former Governor Mark Schwieker and former Congressman Joe Sestak, including their thoughts on the race for governor in a moment on NBC 10 Edition. See you.
You're watching NBC 10 at Issue. You're watching NBC 10 at Issue.
NBC 10 at Issue continues with former Pennsylvania Governor Mark Schwieker and former 7th District Congressman Joe Sestak. Both are co-chairs of the Pennsylvania State Advisory Committee of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Republican Governor Schwieker served from 2001 to 2003. He is a former lieutenant governor and a former Bucks County commissioner. He also served 6 years President and Chief Executive Officer of the Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce. Since then, he's also been involved with the pharmaceutical industry. In addition, Congressman Joe Sestak is a Democrat. He served 2 terms representing Pennsylvania's 7th District, which is mostly Delaware County and parts of neighboring counties. He also is a retired 3-star admiral in the U.S. Navy. He served as President Clinton's Director of Defense Policy on the National Security Council and was the first director of the Navy's anti-terrorism unit after 9/11, known as Deep Blue. He is considering a run for U.S. Senate in 2016. Continuing our discussion, I want to ask you your thoughts on something President Theodore Roosevelt said. If we could take a look, he was writing about governing, and he said, if efficiency is left solely to bad men and if virtue is confined solely to inefficient men, the result cannot be happy. And he went on to say also about governing and on politics, to play the demagogue for purposes of self-interest is a cardinal sin against the people in a democracy. What's your take on that?
Well, I think what he was really referring to there is the very first 3 words of the Constitution: we the people. You know, our forefathers established the Constitution very consciously so government would not be abusive or intrusive upon us, that we could be out there in the marketplace and make it all we can be, rugged individualism. But at the same time, those 3 magic words, they're a virtue. They say that government can make things better for individual opportunity. And so when Andrew Jackson came along, for example, or Theodore Roosevelt that established the national parks, they said, we the people can do certain things so government can be a force for good, for virtue, education, health care.
Governor?
I would offer 2 words as a contribution: Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was able to, in a compelling, intelligent and stylish way, engage Congress and people to take on some of the tough issues, and was successful. So demagoguery only goes so far. I do think there are a number of sitting legislators various jurisdictions that are comfortable with that. And, you know, the centrist approach of hearing folks out and trying to come up with attractive solutions and good public policy often suffers when you have more demagoguery than thoughtful discussion, and it is in much of it coming out of Washington, D.C.
Let's talk about that noise for a moment, though, because there is more campaign spending than ever, thanks in part to U.S. Supreme Court decisions. What do you think the effect is on the creation and passage of good policy?
At times, poisonous and retards the ability to calmly trade ideas and how to shape solutions and then legislate and produce good public policy. And it's not just, Steve, I just don't think it's the campaign treasury and the funding availability thing. It's the it's the permanent campaigning mentality. You know, it's some of the poisonous blogs that are out there that are available, minute in and minute out. I mean, so, you know.
Well, let me ask the congressman about that, because with the cable news channels, with everyone voicing, it seems that it's almost impossible to escape the venom, the anger that people feel. Is it fine because it's a reflection of what's really out there, or has it skewed things and it's not a reflection of what America is? Which take do you have?
Well, I think it's actually been both with the money and that 24/7 has actually skewed things. I think it's been harmful. And that's because that it makes legislators or people who are campaigning less willing to be articulate in here's what has to be done, here's where I stand, hold me accountable. Because within seconds, you all of a sudden can have this massive effort raising money to come down upon that position. And therefore, it gets back to the earlier point I made. It's why we no longer have people who are titans. They're more worried about job security, and therefore they hedge back to their only base and less willing to reach across the aisle to affect progress.
There's an election in Pennsylvania next year for governor. Tom Corbett seeking re-election. How do you think voters should look at the governor, and what measure, what standard should they have in deciding whether or not he deserves re-election?
Well, I mean, far be it for me to understand or articulate what, homemakers might see in this governor, but I gotta believe that they see a hardworking gentleman who can talk about no tax increases, taking an awful lot of some of the reckless spending and terminating it. I think you have to look at tremendous job creation progress relative to the Marcellus shale find and putting that to proper advantage, along with some very impressive related environmental measures that I know are now coming under the gun. But, real job creation progress, and with tax cuts. So I think an awful lot of Pennsylvanians who, watch their pennies see an austerity-minded governor, and with hopefully someone who's interested in another 4 years to accomplish even more.
I'll ask you about the Democratic side in a moment. More with former Congressman Joe Sestak and former Governor Mark Schwieker, including more on a new way of thinking when NBC 10 at Issue continues.
You're watching NBC 10 at Issue.
And NBC 10 at Issue continues with former Pennsylvania Governor Mark Schwieker and former Congressman Joe Sestak. Congressman, on the Democratic side, there are several candidates running for governor in the primaries in May. What measuring stick do you think Democratic voters should use in selecting which person is going to be their nominee?
I think there's two things. First, will that Democrat be willing to be held accountable for what they state and have benchmarks by which they can be measured and held accountable? But second, held accountable for what? And I think there's two important ingredients in that. First, that Democrat who can stand out there and say, look, business is good, particularly small business that creates 60% of all new jobs, that they aren't burdened with undue regulation or taxes, because Pennsylvania has had half the small business job growth as the rest of the nation the last 30 years. And they create the majority of all jobs are our running back. But the second is, are you willing to get the collective resources to address our collective challenges? And in this case, you have, as the governor noted, the Marcellus Shale. Why are we the only state of the top 15 natural gas producers that doesn't have an excise tax like Texas does to have the resources to address education and health care concerns?
Let me ask the governor about that, because this past week we saw what maybe is a corrective measure. The judicial branch, the state Supreme Court, striking down parts of Act 13, saying that it went too far and it didn't protect the environment enough and it took too much local control away. Is that an example of the process working?
I do. I mean, iteratively over time. And these things take time to shape the proper regulatory model. And I do believe, Steve, just to take issue with one characterization there, I think it's more about diminished local control. I think there are some far-reaching positive environmental measures within Act 13 that ought to be preserved. So I'm assuming, given the comments from both the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, there's an opportunity to rearrange. I don't know how it goes in terms of the judicial process, but there's a lot of good in that has created opportunity and jobs in Pennsylvania. You both are co-chairs of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. What are you trying to do there, Governor? Are you trying to start a new way of thinking, a new paradigm? Well, no, we've been this way. I mean, simply put, it's about 1% of the federal budget that is destined for good international relationships, economic development projects that create goodwill for America, and indirectly speaking, keep tourists over there and not within, certainly Admiral Sestak knows this well, keep tourists over there and not within our midst. So it's an important relationship building attempt embodied in the 1% of the federal budget that is used for those ends. What do you think this coalition can help create?
Well, there's a recognition that militaries can stop a problem, but we can't fix a problem. Our diplomacy, the ability to have development in this world where other nations become more peaceful, more prosperous, and therefore more engaged with us, bodes better for our security. So the emphasis upon diplomacy, upon development, is very important to our interest overseas, particularly with an emerging China in the Western Pacific and the global war of terror. The more we can do to ensure, as the governor wisely pointed out, that our engagement overseas make sure that our interests here at home are preserved by being engaged through diplomacy and developmental aid makes for a much more prosperous and secure America.
We call it smart power, intelligent use of America's power and prowess. And you can't put enough soldiers in to stop some of this stuff. So we need, in a positive way, pre-existing relationships in those jurisdictions, in those countries that prevent these flare-ups that ultimately can hurt Americans. And by the way, look at the economy of Pennsylvania, just about every community can point to export-related jobs, and it's about preserving the economic conditions that guarantee those jobs are available to our neighbors.
Well, more than 1 in 5 jobs in Pennsylvania is related to world trade, and more than 250,000 Pennsylvanians are working for a company that's at least half owned by a foreign interest. And that's going up. That's not.
And that's why the coalition is supported not only by, government executives, military leaders, but to a great extent by American businesses.
And increasingly, you can't look at domestic policy and foreign policy. There's one economic policy, one overall type of approach to both here and overseas that bodes better for jobs here at home.
We'll continue in a moment. An action plan from each of my guests as we continue on NBC10 at Issue. Stay tuned.
You're watching NBC10 at Issue.
And we're back on NBC10 at Issue with former Pennsylvania Governor Mark Schwieker, Governor number 44, and former U.S. Representative Joe Sestak, co-chairs the Pennsylvania State Advisory Committee of the U.S. Global Leadership Conference. I want to ask you a couple of quick questions on Obamacare, though, when it comes to the congressional races. Congressman, do you think Democrats should embrace Obamacare this election season coming up?
Yes, recognize it's imperfect, but we have to continue to improve it, primarily because not just that it's morally right, but of the 65% of workers who are uninsured in Philadelphia and the surrounding 4 counties, 65% of the uninsured are actually working. And we lose over $100 billion every year in productivity. We want a healthy workforce that we don't lose that, and that's a primary reason why.
Governor, should Republicans continue the mantra of saying, let's repeal it?
My sense at the neighborhood level is most folks are tired of, the constant negative criticism They want to see, you know, leadership and office holders move on to deal with some of the real issues that what leads to job creation and healthy economies. So I think by and large they want to put it behind them. They want to see effective administration and soon of the Affordable Care Act, and I think that's how I would counsel any Republican aspirants for office. Talk about the meaty stuff that leads to a good paycheck for their neighbors.
For an action plan, then, a headline action plan for folks to protect liberty but move this country forward.
Well, in all candidates, I think there's got to be a preoccupation with economy-building measures. Enlighten tax policy, enlighten regulation, so that job creators, small and large businesses, go out there and do what they've got to do to grow the enterprise to offer the jobs.
Congressman?
First, have people who are willing to be held accountable, willing to lose their job over doing the right thing. And that is, recognize well what the Republicans know very well, this rugged individualism where government is not overly intrusive. But that has to be aligned with the effort that government can make opportunity even better for people with the right vesting in education and health care. And in that way, you can have what we really need in America is not just jobs, but jobs where their wages are increasing.
And if I heard you both right, an independent commission, perhaps, for gerrymandering and selection?
Well, I think on redistricting, it's one of the core conditions
we'll have to leave it
that
there.
Prevents office holders being mindful of the center position.
Thank you both.
Thanks for having us.
Good luck and Happy New Year. That's it for this edition of NBC10.